effectiveness of an aircraft depends upon the efficiency of its crew. When flying at high altitudes, the crew can only remain efficient if they realize the importance of the correct use of oxygen and if they know how to make the most effective use of their oxygen equipment. Without an adequate oxygen supply, they cannot perform their duties efficiently, and they not only endanger their own lives, but they fail in their responsibility to the rest of the crew. It is therefore the duty of every airman to learn why he should use oxygen, when he should use oxygen, and how he should use oxygen. The human body can only function properly as long as it is supplied with three types of fuel, namely solid food, liquid nourishment, and oxygen. Food and drink can be obtained from many different sources, but oxygen can only be obtained by breathing air into the lungs. Air, as everyone knows, being merely a mixture of 20% oxygen and 80% nitrogen. Because breathing is such an effortless process, we tend to take our oxygen for granted, although it is actually more essential than either food or water. Without food and water, a man can live for several days, but without oxygen, he can live only a few minutes. The rarefied air at high altitudes contains less oxygen than air at sea level. This reduction in the oxygen content of the air depends on and is proportional to the fall in barometric pressure. This diagram shows how the barometer falls as one ascends from sea level, where the pressure is 14.7 pounds per square inch. At 5,000 feet, the pressure is 12.2. At 10,000 feet, it is 10.0. At 15,000 feet, it has fallen to 8.3. At 20,000 feet, to 6.8. At 25,000 feet, to 5.5. And at 30,000 feet, the pressure is only 4.4 pounds per square inch. Fortunately, air at a pressure of 10 pounds per square inch contains enough oxygen to satisfy almost all the needs of the body. The first signs of oxygen lack are therefore noticed at about 10,000 feet. The following simple diagrams will help you to understand why lack of oxygen produces such serious ill effects on the human body. Everyone knows that the heart pumps blood through the arteries to all parts of the body. Most people do not realize, however, that the main purpose of the circulation of the blood is to supply oxygen to the tissues. Blood contains a substance which can absorb oxygen from the air in the lungs. Blood which is thus saturated with oxygen is red in color, but when it has given up oxygen to the tissues, the blood, which is now deficient in oxygen, is purple. This animated diagram of the circulation shows how the heart pumps fresh red blood through the arteries to the brain, internal organs, muscles, and other tissues of the body. As the blood gives up oxygen to the tissues, its color changes from red to purple. Finally, the impure purple blood returns to the heart through the veins. Note that the heart is divided into two separate pumping chambers, so that there is no mixing of the impure and the purified blood. This diagram shows how the heart pumps the impure blood to the lungs, where it spreads out into millions of tiny blood vessels whose walls are thin enough to allow oxygen to pass through them freely. Meanwhile, air which is breathed in through the nose and mouth passes down the windpipe and bronchial tubes into the lungs. As the oxygen from the air passes into the blood, the purple color gradually changes back to red. Finally, the purified blood returns to the heart, which continues the cycle by pumping it out to the tissues once more. At altitudes above 10,000 feet, however, the air does not contain enough oxygen to purify the blood completely, and the resulting lack of oxygen impairs the function of every organ and tissue in the body. Since the brain is the most delicate, complicated, and sensitive organ in the body, it is the first to show definite evidence of oxygen lack. Since the brain is the seat of all of our higher faculties, interference with its function leads to impairment of such vital faculties as judgment, initiative, memory, speech, coordination, sense of touch, vision, hearing, and sense of balance. A simple practical demonstration of the effects of oxygen lack can be given in the decompression chamber. This apparatus is an airtight steel structure connected to a vacuum pump by means of which the internal pressure can be reduced to any desired extent. An altimeter inside the chamber behaves as though it were in a climbing aircraft. Note also how the size and brilliance of a candle flame decreases as the oxygen content of the air diminishes. At a pressure corresponding to an altitude of 27,000 feet, the flame is almost extinguished, but a current of oxygen revives it, just as oxygen from a mask would revive an airman suffering from oxygen lack. These 6 airmen are starting on a routine training run in the decompression chamber. They have just arrived at 15,000 feet, and at this early stage there is very little noticeable evidence of oxygen lack. At the end of 30 minutes, however, they have begun to look a little tired, and they are slow and inaccurate in their attempts to solve the simple arithmetical problems which the officer in charge has given them. They have now been taken to 20,000 feet, so that they may experience some of the more severe symptoms of oxygen lack. One early sign is the purplish color of the lips and ears. The tendency to breathe more deeply than normal is an attempt to compensate for the low oxygen content of the air. Frequent yawns and a vacant facial expression indicate that the higher mental faculties are dulled. After only 3 minutes at 20,000 feet, none of the subjects would be capable of discharging his duties in the air. Their judgment is so impaired, however, that they all insist that they feel perfectly well, and some even treat their condition as a joke. In actual flying, this unjustified overconfidence often ends in disaster. At the end of 7 minutes, the man on the left has obviously reached the limit of his endurance, so the medical officer turns on the oxygen and puts on his mask. He begins to recover at once, but he remains weak and confused for a few minutes. Headache and fatigue may persist for several hours after exposure to severe oxygen lack. At the end of 15 minutes, they are quite unable to concentrate on their problems in arithmetic, and they all make many stupid mistakes. This man is so weak and nauseated that he will not even attempt the problem. So just before the scheduled end of the run, he has to be given oxygen to prevent him from collapsing completely. In order to demonstrate the serious consequences of discontinuing the supply of oxygen when flying at very high altitudes, this sergeant pilot has kindly volunteered to remove his mask at 25,000 feet so that we may photograph his reactions. On arriving at 25,000 feet, he is asked to give a sample of his normal handwriting while he is still taking oxygen. He then removes and disconnects his mask, and the medical officer starts the stopwatch. Almost at once there is a noticeable increase in the depth of breathing, and a peculiar, strained expression appears on his face. When one compares his complexion with that of the medical officer, it is obvious that he has become paler, and that his ears and lips have begun to show the characteristic purplish color. At the end of the first minute, he is asked to write a note on his symptoms, and he does this without much difficulty. He has noticed the increased depth of his breathing, and he has also begun to feel slightly dizzy. Dizziness is a common symptom of lack of oxygen and is similar to the early stages of alcoholic intoxication. He is now beginning to lose interest in his surroundings, and the characteristic impairment of judgment is well illustrated by the casual way in which he speaks to the medical officer. Yawning is another typical sign of oxygen lack. At the end of the second minute, he is willing to try his hand at writing once more, but his powers of concentration and coordination are so impaired that he can only make an unintelligible scrawl. He is now almost out on his feet, and it is hard to rouse him even to obey the simplest commands. When he finally succeeds in holding out his arms, they are very weak and shaky. In this close-up, his extreme pallor and the purplish color of his lips and ears make him look deathly sick. You may even be able to make out the beads of cold sweat on his forehead. At the end of 3 minutes, he makes only feeble, clumsy attempts to grasp the pencil, and he cannot even write a single word. The coarse, convulsive twitching of his hand and the deep purple color of his fingernails are signs of very severe oxygen lack. His vision is so dim and blurred that he probably cannot even focus on the paper on which he is trying to write. He is now obviously on the verge of complete collapse. Therefore, the chamber operator begins to reduce the altitude, and as he falls forward unconscious, the medical officer prevents him from striking the floor and begins to revive him by blowing a current of oxygen in his face. A tube is used instead of a mask, since a mask would prevent us from watching his facial expression as he regains consciousness. He recovers very rapidly and is none the worse for his experience except for a dull headache and a slightly dazed feeling. At ground level, he cannot remember anything which happened after the first minute and can hardly believe that he actually passed out. He realizes, however, that this harmless experience in a decompression chamber would have ended in tragedy if it had occurred in flight. Here is a summary of what we have learnt from the decompression chamber. The first signs of oxygen lack are noticed at 10,000 feet. At 15,000 feet, there is loss of efficiency in 15 to 30 minutes. At 20,000 feet, there is marked loss of efficiency and eventual unconsciousness. And at 25,000 feet, sudden loss of consciousness in 2 to 5 minutes. The only safe rule, therefore, is that oxygen must be used on all flights above 10,000 feet. Fighter aircraft climb so rapidly that their pilots take oxygen from ground level. And since night vision is impaired by even the slightest trace of oxygen lack, many night operational crews take oxygen below 10,000 feet. In actual flying, several factors may make the effects of oxygen lack even more severe than those you have seen in the decompression chamber. For example, moving around in the aircraft involves physical exertion, which increases the body's need for oxygen. Even this simple task may double one's oxygen consumption and may produce symptoms unless the flow of oxygen is increased beforehand. Exposure to cold makes the body burn more oxygen to produce enough energy to keep itself warm. An adequate supply of oxygen reduces the discomfort caused by extreme cold at high altitudes, but no amount of oxygen will keep you warm unless you are properly dressed. Poor physical condition aggravates all the symptoms of oxygen lack. The common causes of poor physical condition are well known to us all. They are lack of exercise, too little sleep, and too much tobacco and alcohol. Alcohol is the worst offender of all. Airmen should make it a rule to drink no alcohol within 8 hours of taking off. This little model illustrates the main features of an oxygen supply system. The oxygen is stored in metal cylinders at a pressure of 1,800 pounds per square inch. The number of cylinders depends on the size of the crew and the expected duration of the flight. When the main valve is opened, oxygen flows through the high-pressure pipeline to a number of outlet stations, one for each member of the crew. At each outlet there is a regulator, which consists of a high-pressure gauge, which registers the amount of oxygen remaining in the cylinders, a control knob which regulates the rate of flow, and a flow meter which is calibrated in thousands of feet. The correct amount of oxygen is automatically obtained by setting the flow meter to correspond with the reading of the altimeter. From the regulator, oxygen flows through the low-pressure pipeline to a bayonet socket, into which the pilot plugs the rubber tube which delivers the oxygen to his mask. This is the simplest type of oxygen mask used in the service, but it is very wasteful, because the flow of oxygen is continuous. Therefore all the oxygen which enters the mask during expiration is wasted. Here is an improved system designed to eliminate this waste of oxygen. This piece of equipment, known as the RAF oxygen economizer, is connected between the regulator and the mask, which in this case is the RAF Type G. The principle of the oxygen economizer is easily explained by means of this diagram. Oxygen from the regulator flows into an airtight fabric bag enclosed in a protective Bakelite case. As the bag fills up, the oxygen is prevented from escaping by a spring-loaded mica valve. As soon as the pilot breathes in, however, the suction of his breath opens the valve and allows the oxygen to be drawn into the mask. The tube from the economizer is quite stiff and ends in a bayonet union which clips on to the parachute harness. From the union, a short piece of flexible accordion tubing leads to the mask. At the lower end of the mask, close to the oxygen inlet tube, is the outlet valve through which the expired air escapes. The microphone is housed in the front of the mask. On the other side, there is a third opening, which is closed by a spring-loaded mica valve. After all the oxygen in the economizer has been drawn into the lungs, this valve opens to admit enough air to provide the volume required for a normal inspiration. Here is another system which may be used in place of the economizer to conserve the oxygen supply. This is the RCAF demand valve. It is actuated by the suction of the pilot's breath in such a way that it cuts off the flow of oxygen entirely during expiration and automatically delivers as much as the pilot needs during inspiration. To allow members of bomber crews to move around in the aircraft, small portable cylinders are provided. These can be carried in a canvas bag slung around the neck. Each cylinder contains enough oxygen to last for 10 minutes, and the gauge registers the amount which remains unused. The oxygen flows through this short rubber tube to a side arm on the bayonet connection. In using the portable cylinder, one opens the valve full, disconnects the bayonet union, and turns off the main oxygen supply. A good margin of safety must be allowed when using the portable equipment. A serious accident is always produced when a cylinder runs dry in some inaccessible place in the aircraft. Anyone who has understood these simple facts about oxygen equipment can easily follow the details of actual installations in any service aircraft. In this Hudson bomber, for example, the cylinders are stored in one corner of the fuselage. The captain turns them on and checks the initial pressure before the flight. Each crew member makes a pre-takeoff check on his own outlet. The bayonet connections must fit well, and on turning the control knob, the flow meter needle should move smoothly over the scale. Oxygen should flow freely into the economizer and the mask. Oxygen masks are items of personal equipment, and their inspection should include the metal connections, rubber tubing, helmet straps, and particularly the inlet and outlet valves. The fit should be airtight but comfortable. On a typical flight, the oxygen is turned on at 10,000 feet, and the flow meter is set at the 15,000 foot mark. On arriving at 15,000 feet, the flow is increased to the 20,000 foot mark. When the aircraft has leveled off at, say, 18,000 feet, the flow is set a little above the actual altitude. During descent, it is decreased in similar 5,000 foot steps. Before starting any physical exertion, the flow should be increased 10 or 15,000 feet, and one should take 4 or 5 slow, deep breaths to saturate the blood with oxygen. When the exertion is over, the flow should be readjusted to avoid waste. Slow, deep breaths should also be taken before disconnecting to move to another outlet. But if the journey will require more than a few seconds, the portable cylinder must be used. Members of the crew should exchange signals at frequent intervals to make sure that no one is being overcome by the insidious effects of lack of oxygen. The rate at which the oxygen supply is used up should be checked in the same way as the fuel consumption, and when the needle enters the red sector, the altitude should be decreased to 15,000 feet or less. If the oxygen supply fails, what you have learnt from the decompression chamber should be enough to convince you that the only safe plan is to descend at once to a safe altitude, such as 10 or 12,000 feet. Then you can look for the cause of the failure. Improvements are constantly being made in the design of oxygen equipment, but even the most perfect equipment is valueless unless it is used intelligently. If this picture helps you to make the most efficient possible use of your oxygen equipment, it will have amply fulfilled its purpose.